Great to be with you all via Zoom. I wish we were in person, maybe we all do, but it's a pretty marvelous technology to do the second best thing. I'm speaking to you from the Water Watch office's conference room on Auburn's campus, where I hope internet is better than at my house. And we're going to talk about rivers, of course. This is the title of the book that Larry referred to. And I'm just going to start with this wordless image, wonderful image of a river quite close to you, a little bit to the east and south, the Cahaba River. These are the Cahaba Shoals, and it's an image by a good friend, Hunter Nichols, who lives in Birmingham, has a company called Hunter Nichols Production. And I consider him the heir apparent of the premier river photographer, Beth Maynor Finch, as Beth continues to photograph, but winds it down a little bit in retirement. Hunter has really taken some marvelous, evocative photos, and he was gracious enough to let me use a few in the book. This one I've shown in many of the book talks just to elicit responses from the audience. And I'll never forget doing it with some school children once. I said, when you look at this, what do you feel? And I got beautiful, I got mysterious, I got spooky, I got several different things that we'll return to, with the idea that rivers are a whole lot more than just a scientific or technical subject matter. They do a lot for us, and particularly as Alabamians, as I hope we'll see, they're pretty much part of our cultural DNA. And I used that photo with Hunter's permission for the cover of the book. And it came out in 2018, and then some other editions in hardcover in 19. And it was timed, it was a 5-year project, but it was timed to coincide with our state's bicentennial. And you probably remember December 14th, 2018, Alabama turned 200. And, you know, it was quite amazing to me that the Bicentennial Commission in their mission statement said something to the effect, this is a time to look back on our history and heritage, but also to look forward and pretty much determine what we want to be, who we want to be in the 3rd century. And I really am struck with that, you know, the thought that just a few years ago, we all as Alabamians stepped into our 3rd century. And it raises the question, you know, who do we want to be? And of course, we could dwell, we won't, but we could say, okay, from 1819 to 1919, what images arise in your mind? You know, and you could think of a lot of things, you know, all the way from the first statehood and settlement and Indian removal and plantations and slavery and all the way up to World War I. Or you could say, okay, now I'm going to say, you know, 1918 to 2018, what do you think of in Alabama? And it would raise all other images. And so likewise, let's just imagine, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, you know, what does 2018 or 19 rather, and following mean for us? So anyways, I just took that mission statement. They said, you know, that we need to really look at our heritage. And I say in the intro of the book that that's impossible to really do without an appreciation for the profound influences that Alabama rivers have had on our history and culture. And of course, we will also talk about this in a little bit, but you can see the image on the bottom of the cover is the state seal. And we happen to be the only state in the union that just features a simple river map as our state seal. And that's rather profound too. How did we get that? And how did it persist? And so on and so forth. So those are just some things we'll touch on. Uh, since we're all scattered, I won't take the time to hear everyone's response, but you can't get out of here without having a basic understanding of what might be considered the 10 major basins, river basins of the state. A basin is just another name for a watershed. It's a large watershed. And a watershed is the land area that drains to a common point. So in this case, if we put the points as where a major river meets another river or the sea, that is the point of interest. And if we then extended topographically to include all the land that drains to that point, we end up with these 10 basins. Number 10 can be subdivided many ways, but just for a early quiz, not to be graded, you can just say it to yourself, I guess. If I said number 1, I hope you all know that's the Tennessee River Basin. It's much bigger than shown. It actually goes through 7 states, but this is more or less the Alabama portion of that. Number 2, I'll give you just a half second. That is about a 50-50 Mississippi and Alabama River, the Tom Bigby. It crosses our state line in Aliceville. There's a large reservoir there and flows down to join number 8 to form number 9 that we'll get to. Okay, number 3 should be a great interest to you all. Number 3 is the Black Warrior, a basin I call a giant left foot stomped on northwest Alabama, complete with big toe. And I guess you're more or less all sitting in about the ball of the foot, right below that big toe, that little bulge there. Number 4, the little sister that also is somewhat incorporated by Birmingham. Some call it the crown jewel of Alabama. It's the cover photo, the Cahaba. Then over to the east, the large river that even has a little piece in Tennessee and a lot in northwest Georgia, comes across the state line at just below Rome, Georgia, and that'd be the Coosa River. It joins number 6, its little sister to the east where I am, the Tallapoosa River. And when it joins, it forms number 8 that we'll get to. Number 7 is our Georgia southern border. It starts up around Helen, Georgia. This is not a complete picture of the basin. That's the Chattahoochee. And then 5 and 6 meet in Montgomery, or a little above, around Fort Toulouse, to form the Alabama River. In our state song, it's called "The Stream Whose Name Thou Bearest." And number 9 is the confluence of number 2 and 8. That's the Mobile Delta, sometimes called Mobile Tensaw River Delta. It's actually 5 rivers. You may have been to the 5 river center there as you cross the causeway, but the Middle River and the Appalachie and the Tensaw, the Mobile, there's several there that braid into many sloughs and backwaters. Fascinating area. Some call America's Amazon, wild and woolly. And last but not least, a conglomeration of coastal plain streams. These are waters that start in Alabama, but do not end in Alabama. They mainly flow across the panhandle. Rivers like the Conecuh and the Choctawhatchee, the Pea River, the Blackwater, the Yellow River. And then on the west side of Mobile, there's a little piece there because that's the Escatawpa River, part of the Pascagoula system, and is important to Mobilians because it's their main drinking water supply reservoirs in that upper Escatawpa watershed. For obvious reasons, would you rather have water that drained, 3 or 4 states and came to you through many sinks and toilets? Or would you rather pick a nice forested reservoir right nearby and draw cleaner water? So that's a no-brainer. But at any rate, in our state song, which was composed in the early 30s, 6 of these basins are mentioned in the first 2 stanzas. So again, I'm just putting it out there how important rivers have been for Alabamians for a long, long time. Now, most of these rivers, all but the Tennessee and coastal plain streams, including the Chattahoochee, form the greater Mobile Basin. So the image on the right is just, the giant basin or watershed. So if we put our point at Mobile Bay, it would include this large watershed, again, draining Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, and about 2/3 of our state. The Mobile Basin is by far and away the biggest basin or watershed in the state. Interestingly, it forms less than 2% of the landmass of the continental US, but its discharge of water, that is sheer number of gallons per day, is number 4 of all the rivers in the country, including the Mississippi. And if we put it on an aerial basis, that is gallons per surface acre of water, it dwarfs the Mississippi. Mississippi only has about 30% of the flow per acre, mainly because the Mississippi drains some very dry areas, the upper plains, even some deserts, whereas the Mobile is uniformly wet. We are a water-blessed and wet state. We, Mississippi and Louisiana, rank in the top 3 for rainfall. We push 60 inches of rainfall a year, whereas Nevada has 10 inches a year. So by definition, 10% of all the water in the continental US flows through Alabama, a very disproportionately high amount of water. So you can see we are a river state, not only a river state, but the river state. And our state image, our state seal, is a very fitting one on several levels. So the book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, setting the stage, gets into some of the biophysical, the topography, the geology, the hydrology, and all those are just fancy words for saying how much water and where is it and how does it vary in quality and quantity and physical and biological characteristics by virtue of its geology. So that's where, as Larry mentioned, we worked for a couple of years after the book came out to develop a curriculum. You see pictured on the left there, an educator's guide to Alabama rivers. And one of the neat activities that we developed was called Tectonics and Topography. So what is that? I've had a blast doing this with both adult and children's groups. It's a tea towel. You can get them at Walmart or just probably in your bureau drawer. But we lay it out with a stencil image of Alabama, and we show how continental collisions, millions of years ago, pushed up our Appalachian Mountains, the southern terminus of which goes all the way to Montgomery. So you fold the towel, where Africa, the continent of Africa, actually slammed into North America about 300 million years ago. So, and then from there with yarns, we make the rivers and talk about their courses and characteristics, and we can overlay that with rocks and crops and all kinds of things. But I thought we'd have a little fun here. If you take away the paraphernalia and just look at the state, I've laid my hand down to describe what geographers call the Valley and Ridge province. It's a physiographic province. So let's look at that physiographic province for where you're sitting now, probably, if you're in the Birmingham area, and have this hand analogy of the streams and ridges of Jefferson County. So I do this every time I drive through Birmingham. If I come up Highway 280 from Auburn, I'll hit the thumb and I'll go across those ridges. So again, a little quiz. If we were to do this as a hand analogy of the rivers and the ridges of Birmingham area, the thumb is Oak Mountain, right? Where I guess you're all going to take a field trip soon. So you come up over that ridge and you drop down between the thumb and index finger into a river valley, and that would be the Cahaba River. If we go up over the next ridge with the index finger, that is Shades Mountain. and it drops down into a valley of Shades Creek. And Shades Creek is what they call a Yazoo stream. It runs parallel to the Cahaba, but eventually meets it and just adds to the Cahaba's flow. If we then cross over the Big Kahuna, the middle finger, that is Red Mountain, where the cut is, and I understand it's now being restored. Thank goodness. They're clearing out all the vegetation and fixing the fences and the trails to make it another amenity as it used to be for not only geology students, but the public to understand a lot about our state's wonderful geology. We drop down over Red Mountain and we're into Village and Valley Creeks. And there's two there through Center City, Birmingham, which are now in a new river basin. We've gone away from the Cahaba and we're now in the Black Warrior. We come up over Cemetery Ridge and we drop down to 5 Mile Creek. And then there's a ridge around Tarrant, and we have Turkey Creek that has some endangered, very special fish and a beautiful nature center you may have visited. So all of this to point out Red Mountain is the basin divide between the Cahaba and Black Warrior. That would be the middle finger. And just to credit, Mike Dobbins was the city planner who did this verbally about 30 years ago. And then James Lowry did it in a little write-up. And so I just took their ideas and did it in this animation, which I hope is useful for you. So then I went to do my homework for the talk. And I said, okay, where are you? And I just picked the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And you can kind of see those ridges in green, you know, between Oak Mountain down there in the lower right and Irondale, and then even up into Tarrant City. So, you know, picture those fingers extending down the Southern Appalachian Range. And so the University of Alabama, as I determined, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is in that Village and Valley Creek Valley between Red Mountain and Cemetery Ridge. So I hope you get an orientation and maybe an appreciation for where am I, you know, because it's important to know what watershed are you in. And it has a lot of implications for your drinking water quality and all kinds of things of biodiversity conservation and many other things. So, okay, part 2 of the book, Celebrating the Rivers, is where I drill down into each of these 10 basins and do a lot of history, native sons and daughters, everything from Native American history on up to modern, and also special features, biophysical and cultural, historical for the river. So just dwelling on Black Warrior, figured it's the most relevant for you all. Here's a satellite image that's been enhanced of the whole state. You can see in the yellow bold lettering, the 5 physiographic provinces of our state, the Piedmont, down in that little triangle where I am now, Georgia border, where the Tallapoosa River is. Then we go up over the Talladega Mountains, which is the divide, including Mount Cheaha, to the Coosa. And then we come over the Valley and Ridge, and we're into that Cahaba Black Warrior basins, and eventually on up into the highland rim of the Tennessee. The green part of the rivers where they all get more meandering and wider, slower, is what we call the fall line. It's where we drop off these hard rocks, the crystalline rocks, and the oldest rocks of the state into the coastal plain, and where rivers get a little schizo. They get a very different personality when they cross the fall line, the same rivers, be it the Cahaba, the Black Warrior, or any. They change dramatically in their character and their quality and in their biota and so on. But the Black Warrior is more or less a Cumberland Plateau river, crosses the fall line at Tuscaloosa to enter the upper coastal plain. And the route, as I mentioned, gives it a very distinct upstream, downstream characteristics. So here they are. The blue is the Black Warrior, and the Cahaba is in green right next to it, to the south and east a little bit. Of course, Birmingham sprawls over both the eastern portion of the Black Warrior and the western portion of the Cahaba. And that's of quite importance with regard to the future of the state, and in particular Birmingham's policies and the future of these rivers. But these two rivers are the only two that begin and end in Alabama, if you consider the headwaters to the mouth. All the other rivers either start in another state or start in Alabama and end in another state. So they have a unique claim to fame in that regard. And the Black Warrior, begins up in the hills there with two major tribs, the Mulberry Fork and the Locust Fork. And where they meet on this map, right about the green spot around number 11, where those two big streams meet, that's where it officially is called the Black Warrior. And then that goes all the way to the bottom of this image, the lower left, where it hits Demopolis and meets the Tombigbee River to form what's called the lower Tombigbee at that point. So the Locust Fork and Mulberry, these two big tribs of the Black Warrior, are the second and third longest free-flowing streams in the state in terms of no high dams. We have almost 40 large reservoirs in our state, but thankfully we have some remnants of our free-flowing streams. And the Locust Fork and Mulberry are number 2 and 3. Of course, number 1 is the Cahaba. In 1906, when the Army Corps of Engineers did a survey on it, they kind of condescendingly said that the Cahaba is unworthy of further development. So thank goodness we didn't get it all dammed up. And as a result, the Cahaba River has more fish species per mile than any river in North America. So we have just a glimpse of what our rivers were. They're still astounding, but the impoundments, with all their benefits, had tremendous ecological impacts to the negative in terms of extinctions and loss of our very unique biota. So that leads us to the challenge in part 3 of protecting our rivers. A lovely scene here of Hunter Nichols on the Choctawhatchee River, which is a coastal plain stream. Really makes you want to be on a kayak or canoe floating through that, doesn't it? So this is where I want to, kind of dwell here and finish up the talk. I have an odd chapter to some in the part 3 called Personalizing Your River Ethic. And people say, well, gee, I never thought about a river ethic, but we have an ethic. We all have codes of conduct, and they could come from a variety of sources, our traditions, our religious background, our life experiences. But I want to get you to think about applying it to rivers. So I think of it as a 3-legged stool or a triangle. We have science that I've talked about a little bit here with talking about flow and hydrology and geology and all. It basically answers a question: how do rivers work? So it gives us the things that empirical observation and data can show, but it does not touch on, or it could affect, but not be the same as the ethical question of what ought to be. Scientists usually run away from that question and say, oh, that's a political thing. That's a moral or ethical thing. I just do my studies. But we as citizens need to have these. And I believe that science and ethics is the foundation, why I put it at the bottom here, for our action, which is what should we do? And I think we all have been around the bush long enough that we can think of many policies, national, state, international, of how various policymakers, politicians have taken action without a good consideration of the science or the ethics. And sometimes it's science to action, or sometimes it's, I think this ought to be, let's do it without a scientific consideration, and so on. And there's often the case, lamentably, that not all three are in play when we try to collectively come to a solution about anything, let alone rivers. So in this chapter, I give an overview of 7 celebrations. The book is called Alabama Rivers, a Celebration and Challenge. And I say to develop a personal river ethic, let's just think about these celebrations. Number one, Alabama rivers are part of our history and culture. We believe, and there's archaeological evidence like the Clovis Point in the upper left, that humans came to Alabama between 12 and 14,000 years ago. If you do the math and say, well, Hernando de Soto landed about 1550 or thereabouts, and if you do the math, Native Americans occupied what we call Alabama for 95% of human history or prehistory in our state. So we're the Johnny-come-latelys, but these Native Americans had a very intimate relationship with their rivers. And if you go out to Moundville, you'll see this in their pottery and their stoneware, wood ducks and turtles and fish, all kinds of aquatic critters. They had trade networks well over 1,000 miles long from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. On and on. Native American history is very instructive for us. I could go into great detail on this. I'll just spend a minute. But the upper right is an image that's in our archives and history in Montgomery. It's commissioned by our first governor, William Wyatt Bibb. And he sent that to John Quincy Adams in 1817, and with a letter that said, we think this image represents the concerns and interests of our state. And it's just a river map, even when 2/3 of our state was owned by the Creek Confederacy. And they acknowledged Creeks and Cherokees in the seal, in the symbol, which became our territorial symbol, and 2 years later, our state symbol. So we could go on and on. Just to briefly mention lower left, it's an image from a children's book called Follow the Drinking Gourd. And basically it's a story of how the Tombigbee River was a major artery of the Underground Railroad in the 1850s for helping escaped slaves find their way to free states in Canada by following the river and the drinking gourd, which was their name in code for the Big Dipper. You see in the sky there, looks like a drinking gourd. So it's just on and on, part of our history and culture. A second celebration is that our rivers are ancient and physically diverse. Geologists tell us the Black Warrior and the Cahaba are some of the oldest rivers in the world. And that may strike you as odd. How do you know how old a river is? Just briefly, I do it with the Tectonics exercise, but all those little red arrows in the lower center image are water gaps where the river cuts across transversely the Valley and Ridge province. And you think, well, how do rivers go across mountains? You know, I thought they all flowed downhill. Well, guess what? They do flow downhill. This tells geologists the rivers were there before the Valley and Ridge, before the tectonic plates collided. So some of these streams are in their same channels for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of years. They're very, very ancient and physically diverse. And as I showed earlier, we've played on this with this exercise, and I have gone around the state and have done it in classes. And if you want to get a kid excited, ask who wants to be Africa to slam into this towel and make these ridges. And then we talk about why they grow cotton here and why they have peanuts here and why they have chickens here and why are these rocks found here and here. And it's been a great way to bring complex concepts to everyday life. Speaking of life, Alabama rivers are full of life. You probably have heard this before, I hope you have, that we are a state with astounding aquatic biodiversity, world-class, more turtles, more fishes, more crayfish, more snails, more mussels by far than any other state, and truly a world-class diversity, largely due to that ancient geological history and the immense time and isolation of these populations into little pockets where they speciate and diversify. So Again, I'm a biologist. This is where I could talk for 3 hours, but we'll keep moving here. Another celebration, Alabama rivers are key to our economy. From the very first, with Native Americans in their canoes, the trade routes along the fall line, where products from the uplands and the forested areas met the farthest navigable streams before they hit those falls of the fall line. And it became our towns of Columbus, Phoenix City, Auburn, Montgomery, Centerville, Tuscaloosa, Muscle Shoals. These are all trade routes, trade cities, the floating palaces of the steamboat era, the hydropower era, and ecotourism of today. Alabama rivers provide vital ecological services. The Mobile Basin alone, especially the Delta, the water filtration, the detoxification, the biodegradation of pollutants, cleaning up E. coli and other harmful bacteria, the wildlife habitat it provides. It would cost literally trillions of dollars for us to replicate what our rivers do to provide us clean water, clean and very abundant water. Rivers are beautiful, mysterious, and spiritually enriching. Like the initial photo, again, it's not just a techie thing or a scientific thing for a bunch of nerds. They feed our soul. And briefly, there's the Beth Maynard Finch photo on the Cahaba of this canoeist. And Beth did not know that Jeannie Thompson had written a poem. Jeannie's the executive director of the Alabama Writers Forum in Montgomery. She wrote a poem in 1980, How to Enter the River, that when I read it, I thought, that's Beth's picture. Now the singing of the river is his. He has opened his eyes, and each tree in its green integrity bows as he moves past. And so I introduced these fine ladies. Neither one knew of the work of the other, but a photographer and a poet will help us, will spiritually enrich us with river images and poems. Finally, Alabama rivers are vulnerable and need our care. And again, we could get into our problems of sedimentation and toxins, pharmaceuticals, invasive species, plastics, like this unfortunate dead seagull in the upper right, whose gut was filled with plastic garbage. And so how do we do this? Well, there's many fine programs with children in particular, but also adults, and getting them out in streams and appreciating it. As Larry mentioned in the intro, I directed the Alabama Water Watch program for a little over 20 years. Here's a colleague doing her water tests on her stream, Salgahatchee Creek. And we've had larger projects like the Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps and Cahaba River Society that removed the Marvel slab, coal truck road impediment to the Cahaba a few years ago. They tore it out in 4 days, and the river quickly restored there with fish migrations and invertebrates and others. And even on the political policy side, a little dated, Governor Bob Riley signing an executive order making Lake Martin a treasured Alabama lake, which gave it increased protections. So you can check out Alabama Water Watch. It's at alabamawaterwatch.org. And here's the Black Warrior in Cahaba. Every green teardrop is an active citizen volunteer monitoring site. You can see the data. The red dots are inactive, meaning no data in the last year. They might be active, but just an unbelievable amount of citizen volunteer data. Alabama is one of the premier states in the country for citizen volunteer water monitoring. In fact, Alabama Water Watch will have its 30th birthday in about a month. You're all welcome to the party. It'll be in Auburn in mid-June, and the registration just opened yesterday online at the alabamawaterwatch.org website. So quickly to conclude, I like to think about regional identity or our sense of place. what if we grew up in New England? What's our regional identity? I think we think about whaling and harpoons and rocky coasts and lighthouses. If we were in the Midwest, you know, the Great Plains and endless field of wheat or bison or other things like that. If we were in the Southwest, the cacti, the hot, dry, 10% humidity, amazing part of our country, or the Northwest, the tropical rainforests. What you think of when you think of the Puget Sound, orca whales and other things, but here we are, Alabamians, and we are the river state. We have 132,000 miles of streams, by far the most navigable stream miles in the country, state sealed to present, you know, it's in our bones. Alabama rivers are part of our history and culture, ancient and physically diverse, full of life, key to our economy, providing ecological services, beautiful, mysterious, and spiritually enriching, and vulnerable and need our care. So I'll just close with this image. Again, there's a section in the book, taking care of the small vessels, but just think about it, the great pattern of nature, everything from your own circulatory system to every leaf you pick up and look at the venation or the roots from root hair to trunk of tree or rivers. It's all a story of tiny vessels conveying oxygen and water and nutrients and minerals to the heart of the organism and carrying away waste. So if we're going to save our heart, we better watch our cholesterol and exercise and watch our capillaries, which our doctors do. If we want to take care of a plant, watch the leaves and roots. And if we want to take care of a river, pick the small stream in your backyard and be a steward. Care for it, because cumulatively, that is the only way to really protect a large river. So we just went through Earth Day. I was at the first Earth Day as a rabble-rousing undergraduate student in 1970. And I found it amazing talking to a Greek friend. When I took ecology, they said, well, that word comes from the Greek oikos. And they told us in college it means taking care of the home. But my Greek buddy said, no, it's richer than that. It means taking care of the family's property or even the heritage of the generations. That is oikos. And oikos actually became the root of economy and ecology. So I think that's the heart of what sustainability means, you know, a sustainable livelihood that is appreciative of our ecology. And in our case, it's our rivers. So with that, I'm going to open it up, maybe have some questions or comments, but I really appreciate the time, and just to acknowledge many fine groups and individuals that actually helped me finance the publication of this. It's done with a local publisher in Florence, Alabama. I refused to have it printed in China, where some of the big publishing houses wanted it to be done. I like a small ecological footprint. I like a bioregional approach. I like to support local economies, and I was able to do that, thankfully, through the help of these friends, and they're acknowledged here. So thank you again, and maybe you have questions or comments.
Okay, Bill, that was great. Folks, if you want to make a comment or a question, please unmute yourself first, and then go ahead and fire off the question.
When all is said and done, are natural phenomena more of a threat to our rivers or man?
Very good question. And of course, as you know, they're interrelated. In fact, just last night, the League of Women Voters sponsored a webinar where Scott Duncan up in Birmingham Southern and a fellow who's up in Birmingham with sustainable energy gave a webinar about climate and you know, the intermingling of, to your point, the natural changes and the human caused changes. I would have to come down on the side of human influence when it comes, broadly speaking, to our rivers, because I mean, just as a case in point, the dam building era, you know, from the first dam we built, the first high dam which is Lay Lake on the Coosa River, 1914, a dam that was signed off by Teddy Roosevelt. Actually, not the dam itself, but the exploration of the Army Corps years earlier. And all the way up through the 60s and into the 1980s when Lake Wedowee was built with the R.L. Harris Dam on the Tallapoosa. We have these 30 or 40 large dams. When they were built, you know, they tamed the rivers. They so-called domesticated the rivers. We had a governor who said it's time to put these loafing streams to work. And hydropower really did help to electrify our state and bring it into the modern world. But sadly, it's called the largest mass extinction in North American history. It had devastating effects on our fish, mussels, snails, and other biota. And there are remnants, and we still have, amazingly, we still have the highest aquatic biodiversity in the country, but what we lost is astounding. And so that's just one example of human intervention in our rivers. Of course, today we're withdrawing rivers, water, you know, for sod farms or cities, wastewater treatment plants, the pollution, the plastics, the pharmaceuticals are a major threat. So I don't want to be all gloom and doom because there's some great success stories, like removing the Marvel slab. There's even a wonderful new study with a partnership of the Army Corps of Engineers and the Nature Conservancy to look at reconnecting the Mobile Basin rivers through either fish ladders or bypasses or even radically dam removal of the 3 dams on the lower Alabama River that are basically defunct. They're not providing any hydropower. There's virtually no barge traffic. And if they were to be removed, you know, at Claiborne and Miller's Ferry, it would allow about 6 iconic fishes like Gulf sturgeon, striped bass, blue sucker, Alabama shad to find their way all the way up the Warrior, Cahaba, Coosa, Tallapoosa, and it would restore that fishery that we had. So that's an exciting development that's very, very new. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do lean on human impact, and I do think that it's not regulatable. It is to some extent. You can put a permit on a factory or a wastewater treatment plant, but to solve the big picture, it's public education. It's what I've committed 30 years of my life to. And I hope we all, you know, leave here a little more educated and able to share it with our kids and grandkids and friends and neighbors, because that's what it's going to take, the political will to say, we are the river state and we want to keep it that way.
Bill, you mentioned to me before that we started the talk about this neat little exercise that they did over at Birmingham Southern about the kids with the toilet. You want to relate that to these folks?
Yeah, it's a colleague, Rolf Hazelhoff, who you may know or have heard of him in the Birmingham area. But before the meeting, Larry and I were talking, and the thing I'll never forget is when Rolf, you know, said, Bill, you got to come see this. You know, we've got this center now for water education at Birmingham Southern. We're doing thousands of school kids a year here. And to really capture their interest, he got a large spiral slide like you see at playgrounds, only he retrofitted it to make it a big toilet. And these kids would climb in the toilet and slide down into the sewer and then walk through a wastewater treatment plant and find their way back to a river. And, you know, talk about leaving an impression. You know, I said, I want to go down the slide, you know, but there's just all these cool things that we can do. I hope the Tectonics is one such. You know, people, adults have said to me, I never understood this stuff. It makes it so easy. I just push the towel like you would kick a rug and it folds it up into folds. And you're telling me that's what land did 300 million years ago when South America and the Africa and North American plates collided to make Pangea, the supercontinent? And yeah, that's what happened. And so it defines where our rivers go and all, but anyways, that's the slide and the toilet story.
We've had a lot
I'm sure we're all
of
going to rush over there after we talk and go down the slide.
we've had a lot of talks about the biodiversity and also about ecology and climate change and things like that. My sense of things after listening is that one of the weak spots for us is that the state agencies either have little will or little ability to control a lot of the people who are contaminating things and putting these rivers at risk. Is that your sense of things?
Yes, it is in a nutshell. Certainly acknowledging some wonderful people in our agencies, but overall, and there's a quote in the book which makes you gulp a little bit, but the director of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management said it, and all I did was quote him, that ADEM was designed to stay weak and to rubber stamp, basically. He didn't say rubber stamp, but basically to do the bare minimum that EPA, the federal agencies, require. And so that's where a lot of these river groups you see pictured here, the Rivers Alliance, the Water Watch Association, the River Keepers, and so on, are really the civil society component of this, to keep people honest and to point out problems, or some get feisty and actually bring lawsuits. The Water Watch Association does not, but our emphasis is more education. But it takes all of that because, I would have to say about 10 years ago, I thought we were going to be close to a comprehensive water plan. Alabama is one of the few states left in the nation with no comprehensive water plan. We are very vulnerable to water wars with Georgia and Florida, for that matter. And as things may dry out later, we go into these historic droughts. In 2016, 17, we had 90 days with no rain in Alabama, and water intakes of cities were exposed to air for the first time in their history. They had to extend pipes and get into deeper water. So my point is, we started to go down the path of getting a comprehensive water plan. And the governor back then, Bentley, created what was called AWAG, the Alabama Water Agency Working Group, that had 5 state agencies that work with water: the Conservation Department, the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, ADEM, Geological Survey, Department of Ag and Industries. And they had 200 listening tours and heard, and they got closer and closer and closer to finally pushing it through. And suddenly the new governor disbanded it at the 11th hour. And we all our jaws just hit the table like, what is going on in Montgomery? And, there's a lot of things going on behind the curtain. I'll just be blunt. And so I agree with you. And here's the other point. If ADEM, and I have good friends in ADEM, I have classmates in ADEM that are now, division chiefs and so on. If they do their job, some legislator calls and cuts their budget for the next year. So they're kept well maintained. Alabama has been at the bottom or near the bottom 5 certainly, bottom 2 often, of all states in terms of funding for environmental protection. So that's a sad state of affairs, given the celebration points, our history and culture and all that. So it's like, why are we so adverse to the R word, any kind of regulation, And, nature's going to bite us in the butt if we don't do something, or Georgia's going to have our lunch in the courts, because without a plan, we have very little legal standing to fight over water. And the Coosa, Tallapoosa start in Georgia. So what if they turn it off and say, hey, start it here, it's our water, it's going to Atlanta? So again, not alarmist, not gloom and doom, but it is a real issue. We can't yawn our way through that. And it goes back to, who are we in our 3rd century?
Mm.
Okay, anybody else? Alabama Rivers, Ellen is holding it up there.
Yeah, I forgot my last click. If anybody is interested, the website is there. I maintain a website and it's a mom and pop venture. My publisher is mom and pop up in Florence and I'm mom and pop. I got a couple boxes of books in my basement and I mail them out. So I refuse to be abused by these Amazon type booksellers that want about 90% of the proceeds and give you a little chump change. So I said, well, I'll just do it myself and I'll stay away from printing it in China and, warming the planet with the boats that have to bring it here. So alabamariversbook.com. And I'll have to sadly say on the book and on all the bookmarks, it says .org, but a robot stole that domain and it now is a beauty supply shop. Crazy world we live in with a bunch of bandits out there and cyber attacks. So I had to change the domain and there's the latest one, alabamariversbook.com if you want. If you'd like a copy or at least go to the website and check it out a little bit, be glad to mail you one. And you can have it signed if you want to give it. There's a little place on the order form if you want it signed or custom signed, in any way you want. That's not a commercial. It wasn't intended, at least. I guess it was.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much. We
Enjoyed it.
appreciate it was a good talk, a really good summary of the whole history of this state and its rivers. Thank you so much. And we will reconvene tomorrow, folks, for the last Zoom talk of the spring term when Mary's going to bring us a talk from a historian about Birmingham. So join us tomorrow. And thank you all. And we'll send you off. Take care, everybody.
Very good. Thank you.